Welcome to the Alpha Human Podcast. My name is Lawrence Rosenberg, and today, Jay Feldman of the Energy Balance Podcast returns to delve back into the incredible benefits of a high carbohydrate diet and its effects on autoimmune conditions and liver issues. And we're going to explore the results I'm having health wise as a long-term keto carnivore advocate and practitioner who's now following a lot of what Jay Feldman recommends. Welcome back, Jay.
Thanks for having me back on, Lawrence.
Yeah, great to have you back here, man. A lot's happened in the last few months that we've been together. And for anyone who hasn't seen what we first did together in our first discussion, which was a few months back, I just want to recap it because we discussed a number of things, but really around the idea that early humans did not necessarily evolve on primarily a meat-based carnivore diet, but likely had access to and ate a lot of carbohydrate-rich foods, which is anathema out there in the alternative keto carnivore community. So you challenged the notion that that primitive man thrived solely on a high-protein, high-fat diet. We explored controversial views on fructose as well. Fructose is a demon. Fructose is excoriated as the latest cause of everyone's ills. You address concerns about its potential to cause liver issues and insulin resistance, and that these conditions were likely not caused by our body's response to sugars and carbohydrates. We also discussed a very particular health challenge that I was facing and how I had started to apply your nutritional approach to see if that would resolve my issues. And so now that it's been a few months, I thought it'd be a great idea to discuss the positive results that I'm seeing using the energy balance bioenergetics nutritional approach, and kind of get your opinion as to why I'm alleviating or resolving what was a very, very serious health challenge that I faced. So before I get started, I think maybe it would be good just to set the table for our audience. What type of issues have you seen resolve when taking a bioenergetic, or as you call it, an energy balance approach to diet and nutrition?
Yeah, so I'm excited to dig into all of this. And as you mentioned, we'll be talking about autoimmune conditions, and I've worked with people along the entire spectrum of autoimmune conditions, everything from Hashimoto's to eczema and psoriasis to Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, MS, rheumatoid arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis. So when it comes to autoimmune conditions, these are conditions where I've seen people go from relying on medications, really restrictive diets, avoiding dairy and eggs and lots of other, possibly quote inflammatory foods. And not only are we able to bring those in and get off lots of supplements, but we've also been able to get off of medications that sometimes people had been using for decades in order to prevent flares and prevent inflammatory markers from remaining high, and we're able to get those markers down and get off the medications and not be experiencing those flare-ups anymore. So that's a huge one, and certainly one we'll be talking about today when it comes to autoimmunity. I know we'll also be talking about liver health, and I've seen people go from severe fatty liver to then getting a scan showing nothing at all, showing just a normal liver, and the doctors don't even remember that there was fatty liver, a year or two back,
Right.
and seeing things like liver enzymes come down. And then maybe we could, like, just some other ones that come to mind would be digestion and people who have really severe acid reflux to the point where, they can't lay flat at night. They have to be sitting up. People who are dealing with severe bloating, sometimes, severe constipation, or on the other side, loose stools and diarrhea, or sometimes dealing with, trouble digesting certain foods, fats or protein or carbohydrates. And we're able to completely see that clear up, and people realize, like, I didn't even know how bloated I was until
Right.
I've made some changes and actually know what it feels like to not be bloated. So there's that. Sleep issues, people who are averaging 3 to 5 hours a night because they can't fall asleep. If they do fall asleep, they're waking up throughout the night, and we're able to completely see reversal there and be able to sleep entirely through the night.
Mm.
uh lots of different issues, joint pain, brain fog are things that are really common and, are things I've seen completely resolve. I'm sure there's many others that aren't, energy, I would definitely say fatigue, chronic fatigue as well, going
Mhm.
from that point where you can't exert, right? And you can't work and you can't, walking is a challenge and making food is a challenge to a point where someone is able to then hold a full-time job and a full-time life. And so, yeah, lots of really amazing things that I've been able to witness and see people experience.
Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Okay, so you mentioned autoimmunity, you mentioned liver issues. We're certainly going to talk about this now because for anyone that didn't see our first podcast together, let me also set the stage for where I was. I know I described this on that episode, but let me kind of set the frame for where I was health-wise prior to starting the energy balance approach to my nutrition and my diet. Because over the last 8 years, okay, so this is really important. Over the last 8 years, I've had two bouts of kidney cancer. And in the first instance, 8 years ago, we found a grapefruit-sized tumor on my left kidney. So I had surgery to remove this giant tumor along with the kidney. And I started on, so obviously I dove deep into the research to really make sure I can get a handle on what was happening with me. And all roads pointed to ketogenic diet, right? So I started on a high-fat ketogenic diet to heal myself and keep the cancer under control. Um, Also important to note when I say keep the cancer under control, because there was also a small 2 centimeter tumor on my right kidney. And, they were telling me, we could do ablation, we could do this, we could do that. I didn't want to risk any interventions there as I only have one kidney left. I didn't want to risk damaging the tissue if I didn't absolutely have to. And what was on my right kidney was really small. So I opted to just watch it and really just dive deep into the research on how to keep that in check and keep myself alive and thriving. Hence, ketogenic diet, right? Supposed to, if you do it right, if you do a few things, intermittent fasting, then supposedly you can keep cancer in check, certain cancers anyway. Even the studies are starting to show some beneficial effects there. So over the next couple of years that I was on that diet, I transitioned. I transitioned to adding more protein in the form of red meat, then moved to a carnivore diet exclusively, mostly meat and eggs. That's been for many years my diet. Then 2 years ago, I had another surgery as the same cancer had moved from my kidney to my liver. And this time it was a smaller tumor, also about 2 centimeters. The first one they found on me was ginormous. It was like almost 14 centimeters. Anyway, they removed that small tumor from my liver along with a chunk of the liver and my gallbladder. That went out the door as well. So now the thing is, not having a gallbladder could be a problem when trying to digest high-fat foods, as you're probably aware. I went right back to the carnivore diet. Didn't miss a beat. But you know what? Eating too much steak and eggs gave me a real hard time digesting. I tried ox bile, but it turned out that I digested better actually without the ox bile. And then over time, I was back on mostly meat, but not much eggs. As I was kind of doing better without the eggs, digestion wise. And I was at that point, then I switched away from the higher fat meats like ribeyes, went mostly to lean sirloin, which I eventually switched to an even leaner cut, top round London broil, eating about 3 to 4 pounds worth a day. Okay, so that's where I was. I'm not that big of a guy, probably weighing in at around 160-ish pounds up and down. But immediately after the liver surgery, as you can imagine, my liver enzymes went through the roof, right? Because you're damaging the liver. And the two big liver enzymes that everyone tracks when looking to confirm liver health is ALT and AST. My ALT went to 800. My AST went to 600. And put that in context, normal levels are much lower, right? So your AST should really be somewhere between 15 to 40. And ALT, depending on what hospital, what doctor is measuring it, that can fall anywhere between 17 to 63 for ALT. Ultimately, over time, those enzymes did come way down. So after about 6 months, my AST and ALT stabilized. AST came back down to normal. ALT maybe into the 70s, so really a little high, but I mean, what an improvement. Then what happened is that in all the research I was continuing to do on cancer, I stumbled onto a study that found the type of kidney cancer I had, which is known as chromophobe renal cell carcinoma, did not upregulate glucose metabolism as its primary source of fuel. I was like, wait a second, I've been on a ketogenic diet for all these years, and the cancer I have, which is kind of rare, that it doesn't upregulate glucose metabolism. Instead, this particular cancer uses the lysosome within the cell. The lysosome is an organelle within the cell that recycles cellular parts, and it's a key mechanism of the autophagic process, right? So this cancer's nutritional supply chain actually comes from feeding on the broken, misformed, malfunctioning, or dying cells that the body looks to get rid of. They go into the lysosome chews it up, turns it into the substrates that made them up in the first place, sugars, lipids, proteins. That's how this particular cancer eats. There's a few cancer that does that, that operates that way. And interestingly, this process, right, where the lysosome recycles these broken cells, that gets massively upregulated when going on long multi-day fasts. So as soon as I read this, I'm like, wait a second, couple things. First of all, I'm stopping all fasting because I was a big proponent of fasting. And I'm like, I might actually be feeding the damn cancer. So I stopped. I was doing like 3-day fasts. At one point I was doing, when I had the cancer in the liver, I was doing 2 48-hour fasts a week. And then sometimes I was doing one 3-day fast per week. Anyway, and then always intermittent fasting. I stopped it all. And I started to add, because all of a sudden I realized, wait a second, glucose isn't being upregulated. So I added some fruit to my diet. I added honey, and I increased. And at one point, I'll tell you what, Jay, I was eating probably 100 grams of fructose between the honey. I was eating apples. I was eating pears, which you set me straight on, by the way. We'll talk about that. But then out of the blue, as all this is happening, my blood work comes back, because we monitor me constantly because of the cancer. My blood work comes back, and my liver enzymes all of a sudden are through the roof again. This is about a year after the liver surgery now. And I tried to figure out what the hell is going on here. What could have caused this? And I'm kind of looking at what am I doing that's different. And the only things I could work out. So here was my working theory, is that, so I was prescribed a cream for a plantar wart, the side effects of which I failed to research. I mean, what could be the harm in taking a foot cream? Well, lo and behold, the cream turned out to be a skin cancer medication. Of all things, that's what they gave me, an immunotherapy that I believe, beyond the stated side effects of altered liver function and elevated liver enzymes, once I looked into what this drug actually did, I believe it also probably triggered an autoimmune issue. So the stated side effects are elevated liver enzymes, but I believe it triggered an autoimmune reaction, possibly then exacerbated by high levels of stress hormones from the 7-year keto carnivore diet I was on. Maybe further aggravated by dumping a load of fructose, honey, apples, pears, over 100 grams a day into the diet. Maybe that had something. So who knows which one of those things was the culprit? All I know is my liver was stressed out. So at the height of these liver issues, which turned out to be about 3 months ago, my ferritin was super high, around 800. Normal is around 30. They say the highest should be 400, but should be much lower than that. Probably should be over 100 if possible. But my ALT rose, my liver enzyme ALT rose to almost 400. 400. What's going on? 400. AST rose to almost 200. My doctors are freaking out. They're like, what's going on here? They want me to do a biopsy. And then a scan showed that I had mild steatosis, NAFLD. What the hell's going wrong with me? I'm wondering. So I was being pushed hard by my doctors to go in for a liver biopsy, because all the tests they were doing, they couldn't find any viral issues, all the hepatitises you can think of, and there's more than you know. None of them came back positive. All the other, they looked at megalovirus, they looked at Epstein-Barr, they looked at everything. So they're like, you got to have a biopsy. And I'm like, I got to figure out what's going on. And I'm trying to resolve it without having the biopsy. I tried TUDCA. right? Especially as my gallbladder was gone, I figured maybe that could help. I tried quercetin to chelate iron. I tried IP6 to chelate iron. But around this time, I also discovered you, right? And it's actually a rediscovery for me of bioenergetics via your podcast, because I had originally read some of Ray Peat's material years ago when I first got cancer, but I dismissed it as soon as he mentioned sugar. Jay, I was out the door. I was like, no, you can't be eating sugar. So I was like, this guy Ray Peat's a nut. Forget it. But I found you, started listening to your podcast, and the way you approached the bioenergetic approach, the misconceptions of a high carbohydrate diet, why maybe it's really a low carb diet or a carnivore diet, which is causing the type of stress that might be, and that fructose might not really be as much of a problem and as much of a demon as everyone makes it out to be. Your information was nuanced enough to be highly intriguing, given how the entire alternative health sphere is really just slamming carbs, including myself, right? Especially simple carbs, right? Sugar is the worst poison and toxin you could put in your body, supposedly. But you pointed out some really interesting facts about metabolism and sugar. So I started deep diving into all of your episodes on fructose, on low carb diets, on NAFLD. And I ultimately downloaded your food guide and made significant dietary changes based on your protocols, based on your content. And I've seen, Jay, remarkable improvements in my liver function and several other areas as well, which I'll mention later on. So I definitely want to delve into those details. I want to show our audience. I'll share my screen. I want to show the audience those improvements. So it's not just me talking about it. I want them to see the blood work. And we'll take our viewers through that. But first, I want to explore whether or not a very low carb or keto diet helps or exacerbates autoimmune issues from your perspective. As I believe what I went through, again, was very likely an autoimmune reaction. And if I want to talk about if a bioenergetic higher carbohydrate diet might be a better approach to dealing with autoimmune reactions, which are ultimately inflammation related issues, right? So does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right. So you mentioned the gamut of autoimmune issues that you've seen people for and what's been resolved with your approach. And there are with that said, there are tons of studies supporting the assertion that actually a ketogenic diet is what you should be doing if you have an autoimmune issue or if you have NAFLD, but especially when it comes to autoimmunity, irritable bowel syndrome, celiac disease, arthritis, leaky gut. I mean, all of these things. You got to get the fructose out of your diet. You got to get the carbohydrates out of your diet. Ketogenic's going to, carnivore diet, man, psoriasis, get on a carnivore diet. It's going to stop your psoriasis, skin inflammation, skin issues. You see videos on it. You see influencers talking about it. You see studies on it. And there are a lot of studies supporting these assertions. So I want to highlight a few of them here. And I want to do that so that we're not just talking anecdotally and that we're giving the carnivore keto community that side of the equation, it's fair exposure, okay? So let's do that. I'll put up a study, and I won't ask you necessarily to comment on the study because it's not like you've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. It's really just the assertion. I'd want to hear your view, the alternative view, right? But let's use these studies as maybe a way of setting the stage. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me here. All right. Do you see this study that I have up here, how sugar promotes inflammation?
Yes.
Okay. So this is an article which reports on how scientists at Julius Maximilian University in Rosenberg discovered that excessive consumption of glucose directly promotes the pathogenic functions of certain cells of the immune system, and that conversely, a calorie-reduced diet can have a beneficial effect on immune diseases. They say people who consume sugar and other carbohydrates in excess Now, they never define what an excess means, but I will show you what I think what the community believes in excess is in a moment. But they say that people who consume carbs in excess over a long period of time have an increased risk of developing an autoimmune disease, such as Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, type 1 diabetes, chronic inflammation of the thyroid gland, et cetera, et cetera. They say it's because Th17, an immune cell, expresses high levels of the glucose transporter GLUT3, which facilitates glucose uptake. And once inside the cells, glucose is converted in the citric acid cycle in the mitochondria, and then it's converted to acetyl CoA in the cytoplasm. And acetyl CoA not only participates in lipid biosynthesis, but also regulates the activity of pro-inflammatory genes. So this is kind of their theory, their mechanism. Now, I want to also share another study, because here's where we'll define what sugar in excess means, right? So let me pull this one up here. Oh, sorry about that. I think I lost it. So this is a study, hold on, McMaster University. Sorry about that, Jay.
No, it's fine.
Let me pull this up. Yeah, hold on, I just lost it. Let me get the history here. Yeah, that's it. Nope, look at that. We can't get it back. Oh, there it is. Is that it? Yeah. Dietary sugar lowers immunity and microbiota that protect against metabolic disease. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this one here, right, this is by McMaster University, which suggests that sugar promotes inflammation via Th17 cells. They define what excess sugar means here, right? They say that a high-fat diet, when combined with high sugar intake, and a high sugar intake is defined as 10% added sugar, such as sucrose and maltodextrin, that it leads to a loss of protective segmented filamentous bacteria, SFB, in the gut, which is essential for maintaining Th17 immunity. So again, speaking about Th17 immunity, and this reduction in Th17 cells results in increased lipid absorption and early stages of metabolic dysfunction. So these two studies are similar in that they look at Th17 immunity. They look at what sugar is doing to affect it. One is kind of more focused on how the microbiome affects it versus the other one really just talking about, the conversion, the GLUT3 receptors sucking in a lot of glucose, acetyl CoA, lipid biosynthesis, and then, of course, upsetting the microbiome. I'm sorry, causing these issues of dysregulated metabolism. But ultimately, I want to hold off with respect to your views on sugar and the microbiome just for a moment, because I want to discuss that when we get to another study that we'll highlight. So let's simply address concentrating on sugar being the culprit, being the bad guy, and affecting immunity via these Th17 cells, or just via immunity in general. I find it interesting that the high-fat part of the diet is not called out as the significant issue, but rather it's the 10% of the diet coming from sucrose that's why we have inflammation and autoimmune issues. So given that hypothesis, I would love to use this to contrast your view, because I know that your view is that sugar does not cause inflammation. Can you elaborate on why you have an alternative viewpoint on sugar and its effect on autoimmunity?
Yeah, definitely. So, as you were saying, I have not seen these studies, so we can't comment on any of the specifics of what they're looking at or even what mechanisms they're citing or anything.
Exactly.
But however, I do want to mention, at least in the first one, you were citing one of the mechanisms that they were looking at was basically increased glucose uptake, leading to, it sounded like, an increase in citrate accumulation and then conversion down the fat production pathway,
Right.
and that also overlapping with the inflammatory pathway.
Right.
And so what they're kind of pointing to there is excess fuel and triglyceride production, which, as we know and as they show in mice or rats on high fat diets as well, that excess fuel relative to what can be used will overlap and create inflammation. And obviously, we don't want to be creating inflammation. That's not ideal, whether we're talking autoimmunity or anything else. Inflammation is something we want to generally avoid. So it's true that if we're at the point where we're seeing, whether it's coming from lipids or from carbohydrates in the first place, if we're getting to the point where we're seeing a buildup of citrate, conversion through, and then leaving the mitochondria, then conversion to acetyl-CoA, malonyl-CoA, and all the way down to produce fat, there will be inflammation there. The question I think that we're coming to here is that uniquely caused by carbohydrates or caused by sugar? And the short answer that I would say is no. And basically what we're seeing in this situation is a couple of things. I mean, this is the same pathway that's cited when it comes to fatty liver disease. We talked about this last time, and I'm happy to go back through it again. But when people are talking about fructose being uniquely fattening and driving inflammation in the liver, they're looking at these same pathways. And what they often leave out is the context with which this is occurring. And normally it's a situation where, for example, in the second study you mentioned, you're taking already unhealthy rats that, in this case, were on a high-fat diet prone to obesity and whatnot. You're normally feeding them in a way that leads to a lot of endotoxin production. So normally they'll feed fructose on its own, which doesn't get well absorbed, feeds bacteria, and those produce endotoxin, which is going to impair our ability to use the carbohydrates that are coming in or fat that are coming in. And then you provide a massive amount of carbohydrate on top of that, on top of normally a high-fat diet as well. So you've got tons and tons of fuel coming in. You have mitochondria that are not working properly, and then you have basically a backup where they're not getting, the fuel is not getting converted down to energy, and instead it gets converted to fat, and you have upregulation of inflammation. Now, there are a couple of things, and we talked about this a bit last time as well, that are major confounding variables here. And if we address those, there's no issue from the carbohydrates. One of those is endotoxin. So in those studies, if they then feed or give the rats antibiotics, so they don't have any bacteria and don't have any endotoxin production, then they give them the same amount of fructose, same amount of carbohydrates. There's no issue. They don't see the increase in inflammation. They don't see the increase in fat production. And that's because the mitochondria are working fine. They're not having this endotoxin problem, and they're able to convert that fructose into ATP or to glycogen or whatever they need. The second is the polyunsaturated fats. And if they block, so they'll bring in LOX inhibitors in some studies, or COX inhibitors to block the inflammatory prostaglandins that are produced by the polyunsaturated fats. And they can do that and then feed them the same amount of fructose, even with the bacteria, even with the endotoxin. And it still won't produce excess triglyceride and inflammation. So that's a second major confounding variable. And then the third one, of course, is if they don't feed pure fructose, but they just feed regular carbohydrates, there's no issue. And the last factor to consider, especially when we're talking about the liver, is the difference between rats' capacities in their liver for energy production and handling substrate versus humans. Our livers are much more robust and do a much better job of using the fuel that's coming in. And that's partially because our livers are much more active, and they are basically the storage organ for our brain, which is much more active and larger relative to our needs compared to a rat. And so we need to have better functioning livers to support our brain. So that's the basis for a lot of this.
Okay.
A lot of this this kind of research. But coming back to the premise that you were mentioning, or at least what they were mentioning in that first study, which is basically increased carbohydrate. And they were talking about they were talking about possible links, but in the very beginning, they were saying, there's an association between people who consume carbs in excess and sugar in excess. And I think I don't know if they were looking at the microbiome or autoimmunity. Of course, it's always worth mentioning, or we always need to mention that the association there has many confounding variables, right? People, it says in the first line, there are people who consume sugar and other carbohydrates in excess over a long period of time have an increased risk of developing autoimmune disease. It is always necessary to mention that the people who are consuming carbohydrates and sugar in excess are generally people who are not health-oriented, not doing things for their health. They're not trying to sleep well. They're not managing stress. They're not active and exercising. They're not eating a healthy diet, right? The average person the vast majority, 99% of the people who are eating sugar in excess don't care at all about their health, because obviously in the health world, it is well known that you're not supposed to do that. So we have like some major confounding variables there when we're just looking at association. And then if you do take any individual cell, in this case, they're looking at those Th17 cells, and you add a ton of fuel, more than they can handle,
Mhm.
then they will produce triglycerides from that substrate, and that will create an inflammatory state. I don't know the specifics of the study, but that will happen there, and acetyl CoA will be produced. That's as you're highlighting there.
Right.
Now, there are two situations there. One is an overload. I mean, there's two sides to that coin. One is the overload of fuel, and the other is relative to the amount that the tissue, cell, organism can handle. And what we're kind of exemplifying with those rat studies is that there's a lot of things that can make it so that we can't handle very much fuel, right? In the case of a really stressed out liver from endotoxin, we
Mhm.
can't handle much fructose without immediately converting it to fat and creating inflammation. But if that's not the case, if we're taking a healthy organism, or at least a not severely deranged organism, then normally you can handle a pretty decent amount of substrate coming in without converting it to fat. And it's not really different whether you're overloading it with carbohydrates as a fuel or fatty acids as a fuel. And as we've pointed out last time, and I'm sure we'll come back to this time, in the case of fatty liver, most of the fat that's stored there is coming from fatty acids. It's not coming from carbohydrates anyway. So that's just some important thought processes to consider when we're looking at a study like this.
Right. And yeah. And, again, I think it's less about the study, and more so about the narrative that these
Right.
studies support, because there's a lot of these studies, right? And you can just put sugar and inflammation, and it's
Yeah.
everywhere, right? But it's the confounders that are not being discussed. It's right. That's not what's being looked at. And I also know that, as well as I'm sure you do, that you can ensure that a study says whatever you want it to say. You can find anything that you're looking for ultimately with a study, right? So anyway, that makes a lot of sense to me. I really wanted to get your sense of autoimmunity and sugar's impact on it, right? Because ultimately, I think what we're saying here is, if you were to, and so let me pose this then. So if you just have, for the most part, the majority of the fuel, not all of the fuel, but if it was flipped,
Mhm.
if the majority of the fuel was not in excess, and if it was carbohydrate, even if it was sugar, simple sugar, right? And you added in excess 10% fat, would you see the same problems?
Yeah,
In
typically.
your view?
Typically, yeah, and and especially when you're taking, the rat model or whatnot, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you're saying, basically, excess fuel relative to what can be used is going to create fat
So,
synthesis,
okay.
is going to create inflammation, and that's not going to be ideal from an autoimmune standpoint. And so, I know that was the question you wanted to get to. Sugar and autoimmunity, is there anything actually to be concerned about there? And the short
Right.
answer, I would say, is definitely not. And when we look at autoimmunity, there are a few different avenues you can take as far as what the drivers are. I think in a lot of the alternative sphere, functional medicine, and like the paleo keto world, most of it is focused on the gut. And I would say that's certainly an important part. I don't think it's the full picture. And they focus on this molecular mimicry idea, which we can come back to. But the short answer is that the gut is a huge component, and we want to make sure we're not feeding bacteria excessively, producing endotoxin, creating intestinal permeability. Those things can definitely be things that drive the systemic inflammatory state and systemic damage that underlie
So,
autoimmunity.
okay. So to hold off on that, because
Right.
right, because that's really the next question. Let's address the microbiome issue, right? Because,
Right. But
go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, but just coming back to sugar, just trying to come back to the sugar and autoimmunity question, because I know that's what you were wanting
Yes.
to get to with these studies. So in general, in autoimmunity, what we're seeing is that there's a systemic inflammatory, stress, energy depleted state that allows for damage in certain tissues, and our immune system responds to that by creating antibodies to clean up that damage. And we know that damage can vary, whether it's happening in the thyroid, in the joints, in the connective tissue, in the skin, in the liver, can happen in pretty much any tissue in the intestines, but it is always underpinned by energy depletion, chronic stress, and chronic inflammation, right? Those are known to be the underlying drivers. And when it comes to sugar and a question of whether it impacts those things, when it comes to the microbiome, I would say there's really no issue. And I guess we'll get to that next. But when it comes to chronic stress, inflammation, and energy depletion, having sugar is one of the best ways that we can oppose those things, that we can reverse those things. Assuming that we're our mitochondria are working okay, then we need fuel like sugar to produce energy. That is also the number one thing that turns down our stress response, turns down the chronically high glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol that we see in fatty liver, that we see in autoimmune conditions, and that trigger the autoimmune response. It's well known that cortisol shifts the immune system toward more of an autoimmune prone state. And sugar is one of the best ways we can turn down cortisol. And when it comes to inflammation, again, we need that fuel and the energy it produces to resolve any inflammatory state, to repair, to have proper cleanup processes. And outside of the context of deranged metabolism and excessive amounts of fuel, which is what those studies show, sugar is one of the most important things for reversing those things, for turning down inflammation, stress, and providing energy.
So, okay, to your point, though, of those two things you mentioned, wildly dysregulated metabolism and excess fuel. Take out the excess fuel for a moment. Just
Sure.
so dysregulate, which is probably, but it's dysregulated probably for the excess fuel. But let's say you have dysregulated metabolism, you remove the excess fuel
Mhm.
and you replace it because I know your view is that, so for instance, so let's look at diabetes, for instance.
Mhm.
I guess type 2 diabetes. Right? You take out, that's a dysregulated metabolism, which I don't know if we have to hedge here, because I believe your view is that actually, if you give sugar to someone with type 2 diabetes, that you'll often see, and this is, I believe, has been shown in studies, that you'll often see the type 2 diabetes resolve, which means that even in the case of a dysregulated metabolism, minus the excess fuel, if the fuel is sugar, the issue will resolve. Is that correct?
So, yes, but
Okay.
so an important part of fixing the underlying metabolic dysfunction, the underlying mitochondrial issues, is providing enough carbohydrate like sugar,
Okay.
because one of the main drivers there is excess stress hormones
Mhm.
and basically mitochondria that are stuck on fat metabolism, which furthers the inflammatory process. So sugar is really helpful for reversing those two things. And so it does help in fixing the mitochondrial state. So the reason why I still have that caveat is because if you just take a moment in time, you take an organism that is in a dysfunctional state and you add sugar and look at what happens that day, it's not going to look great.
Right.
But by providing that carbohydrate, you help to reverse the underlying metabolic issue. And that, as you were saying, that's why we see that in insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, that actually increasing the content of carbohydrates improves the insulin sensitivity. And in extreme examples where you really increase it a lot and also drop the fat down a lot, and I know we'll talk through some of these too, you can see nearly reversal. You can see people getting off of insulin and losing lots of weight. And so that is a part of fixing the underlying process. Now, there are other things that we want to consider as well. So I don't think in most cases it's a great idea to say, yes, my mitochondria aren't working great, but I'm just going to add a lot of carbs and hope that that is enough to fix it. I would rather do that, but also address the other factors that are likely impairing our mitochondria to work as well, like PUFA and endotoxin and nutrient deficiencies and excess iron, like we were
Right.
alluding to. So that's why I just always want to make that kind of
That's fair enough.
stipulation. Yeah.
Absolutely. That makes complete sense. Okay. So we're getting a bit off on a tangent there, but getting back to now the microbiome being very important in immunity, right? And how a different, a dietetic approach can hinder or help. Let's get back on that, because these studies have made some assertions as to what's really at play in the gut that's leading to this issue. And so let me share the screen again and go back to, let's go, we're back to this, oh, that's not it. It's again, sorry. Is that the McMaster? Where's the McMaster one? Whoop. There you go. So that's the McMaster study, right? So this is the one on the microbiota. And so we already know from this study that's on the screen. You could see that, Jay?
Yep.
We already know from that study at McMaster University that they put forth the hypothesis that the microbiome plays a crucial role in the immune response. We all know that. But when combined with a high sugar intake, again, 10% sucrose or maltodextrin, not even saying fructose, it leads to a loss of this SFB bacteria, right? Segmented filamentous bacteria in the gut, which is essential for maintaining the Th17 cells and their immunity. And this reduction in the Th17 cells results in the increased lipid absorption and the early stages of metabolic dysfunction. Okay. But I want to show another study. So let me just pull this one up now. Is this the one? I've got them all over the place. Oh, that's my... No. Well, maybe I closed. Oh, there it is. Okay. So another microbiome study, right? This one, ketogenic diet alleviates colitis by reduction of colonic group 3 innate lymphoid cells through altering the gut microbiome. This study found that the ketogenic diet alleviated colitis by altering the gut microbiota, increased beneficial bacteria like Akkermansia, and decreased harmful bacteria such as Shigella. And the ketogenic diet also protected the intestinal barrier function and reduced inflammatory cytokines. These effects were shown to depend on changes in the gut microbiome. So the claims by these studies, the McMaster study, this study here, are very clear that high-fat diet is good for lowering autoimmune inflammatory conditions because of beneficial effects on modulating immunity via a positive effect on the microbiome. However, if you add sugar to that mix, then we get the promotion of the inflammation. However, again, I know your view on sugar and carbs and let's focus on the microbiome, not on the metabolism, right? So yes, the metabolism, you add the excess fuel, you add the sugar, and then we get that. But you've got some very distinct views on the microbiome, healing your gut, and the difference between a ketogenic diet for microbiome health versus a carbohydrate-rich, energy-balanced approach. So I'd love to hear your view on this. Where are they getting it wrong? And again, we don't need to get into the intricacies of the study, just that it's the narrative I want to kind of shake up a little bit here.
Sure. So it's important to mention, and we, maybe it would have been something I could have mentioned earlier. A lot of people see relief from a ketogenic diet, low carb paleo diet on autoimmunity, and that's great. And one of the main ways, I would say the primary one by far, is through the gut microbiome, through the effects on the gut.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because, as we're kind of alluding to here, but as is seen in lots of research, there's associations, pretty strong ones, between different autoimmune conditions and the presence of particular infections, excess of particular bacteria, basically bacterial overgrowth and microbial imbalance in the gut in the gut, inside of the intestines. And so when that's the case, and we're eating a standard diet that includes carbohydrates, we're typically consuming a lot of fibers and other carbohydrates that will feed the bacteria. When we're feeding an overgrowth of harmful bacteria, they produce a lot of toxic things. One of the most well-known ones is LPS, or endotoxin. This is implicated in autoimmune conditions as well as pretty much every other chronic health condition. And that will exacerbate not only inflammation in the intestines and intestinal permeability and things like that, but it also it causes damage systemically and triggers an autoimmune response in people who are susceptible and are susceptible to damage in certain areas. So reducing endotoxin is massively important, not only for obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, cardiovascular health, and tons of other issues, but also for autoimmune conditions. And anything that we can do to reduce endotoxin and not feed harmful overgrowths of bacteria in the intestines will go a really long way and provides a ton of benefits. So,
Yep.
in that way, a low carb diet is great. And that's where you see most of the benefits, whether we're even talking in epilepsy, whether we're talking here in terms of autoimmune conditions. There's a number of studies where they'll do, they'll have a group of mice or rats on a ketogenic diet. They see all these benefits in the microbiome, and then they'll do a fecal microbial transplant to move that microbiome to a different rat or mouse that's on a normal diet,
Mhm.
and they have the same benefits. They're still, seeing the improvements that we're seeing without even being on a ketogenic diet, as long as they have the improvement in the microbiome. So what that tells us is this is one way to provide relief in terms of this harmful overgrowth in our microbiome, and that's great. That can definitely help when it comes to autoimmunity. However, A, it's not the only way to do that. B, there's a long-term cost. And C, sometimes it can make the microbiome itself worse in the long run. And this is something that's pretty well recognized, especially on a high protein diet. So
Okay.
on a ketogenic diet, it's a bit lower on protein, very high in fat. But as
Yep.
soon as we start to increase that protein amount, especially beyond kind of what most people are able to effectively digest, you start to see a further shift into a pathogenic microbiome. And you tend to see a lot of harmful things being produced in the intestines, like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. You tend to see inflammation in the intestines as well. So it's not as simple as you just take out carbs and the issue is fixed. It is one way to provide relief, but it can also, depending on how we do it, can make things worse. And it's certainly not a long-term approach, because there are going to be other costs to this diet that that will upregulate stress and stress hormones and downregulate thyroid and reproductive hormones, among other things, which will then kind of in the long term can lead to a recurrence of something like an autoimmune condition, and can definitely lead us to be susceptible to it in the future. So it's something that will work short term as a result of not feeding the harmful bacteria. But it's not the only way to do that. There is a cost, and there are better approaches that will still have that same benefit without the cost.
Yeah. Okay. So fair enough. And again, I think that's one of the things that I might have seen is that, I mean, they'll show that any intervention
That too.
from, right, any intervention from someone who lives a very, very uh, uh, poor lifestyle with respect to poor nutrition and poor diet. So, right, so uh, any type of a Western, highly processed junk food diet, you do any intervention to that, keto, carnivore, low fat, um, fasting, you name it, you're going to see great results. It's what happens 2, 3 years down the road on a carnivore diet for most people. What happens to most people, 5, 6 years down the road on a ketogenic diet? What starts happening to the body over time? I think that's where things get more interesting, because as these stress hormones are being produced nonstop when they're not supposed to be produced 24/7, 365 for years and years or years, something is going to break. And again, I think this could have exacerbated in my issue, but we'll hold off on that for the moment. Okay, point taken on microbiome. So now let's get into away from autoimmune, liver issues, NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Let me put up this study here as the basis for the question. Okay. So you can see that, Jay? An
Yep.
integrated, yeah. So the study, the paper is called An Integrated Understanding of the Rapid Metabolic Benefits. And that's interesting, rapid, right? So like, yeah, you see it immediately. The benefits of a carbohydrate restricted diet on hepatic steatosis in humans, right? So hepatic steatosis, liver fat, right? So they highlight in this paper that there are several mechanisms that they consider beneficial. So it's not just one. These include increased mitochondrial B oxidation, decreased hepatic de novo lipogenesis, beneficial shifts in the gut microbiota. We've talked microbiome for the moment, but that's just another one they're seeing. Everything's linked, right? And reduced inflammation. However, right, I know you argue that it's these same mechanisms, particularly increased fat oxidation, which actually can be harmful in cases of NAFLD. So how can that be? Right? Like here we're saying, the study's saying quite clearly, I've got other studies that say this, that it's lipolysis, right? It's fat oxidation, which is the winning result that you're looking for here. But I know I've heard you say that actually this is where things can actually get pretty ugly. So can you explain why you believe that, these mechanisms, if not just that particular mechanism, but however you want to respond to this, which are touted as beneficial, are instead likely to be harmful in the long run for managing NAFLD?
Yeah, so there's a couple of important points that are worth mentioning first, as far as what's actually going on in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Firstly, is that, let's see, where do we start? The first would be that we already see elevated levels of lipolysis systemically. That's
Yes.
like very, very much elevated. We already see elevated levels of beta oxidation and fat metabolism in the liver. That's already happening to a very large extent. And then when we look at where the fat is actually coming from, most of it is not coming from de novo lipogenesis.
Okay.
They've done studies, and this is on people who are on only a 30% fat diet. So they're still on a relatively low fat diet.
Okay.
And in that case, when they have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, only 25% of the fat that's being produced in the liver is coming from de novo lipogenesis, coming from the carbs, whereas 75% is coming from the fat, 60% is from the fat stores, and 15 is from the dietary fat. Now, if you were to go on a low carb diet and increase the dietary fat, then that number would probably be skewed even higher toward more dietary fat and less carbohydrates as de novo lipogenesis. But you already see in this state high levels of fat oxidation. You already see high levels of lipolysis. You see increased fat storage both during fasting and during like post-feeding, postprandial, because even when you're fasting with the high stress hormones, there's increased lipolysis, and the liver is so dysfunctional, it's taking up those fatty acids and storing them. That's where most of the fat is coming from the body's own fat stores. So from that clear characterization of what's going on metabolically in fatty liver disease, going on a low carb diet doesn't change that at all. In fact, it just increases lipolysis and increases beta oxidation, which are already increased and partially responsible and driving this state. They're already leading to the increased fatty liver. So we know that those are not mechanisms through which low carb diets are going to provide any benefit in terms of fatty liver disease.
Interesting.
Now, but what, and again, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but the one thing that is known to be a very major driver of fatty liver is endotoxin and the gut microbiome. And this is why, again, you can create fatty liver by feeding fructose that feeds bacteria, produces endotoxin, causes fatty liver, and just an antibiotic, meaning you're clearing out those bacteria and preventing the endotoxin production, prevents that effect. And that's essentially what you're seeing here with the low carb diet. It's the equivalent of that antibiotic because you're not providing anything to feed those bacteria, or you're dramatically reducing that feeding. So you're basically taking away the endotoxin, which is so closely associated with every chronic health condition. You can see what they call as metabolic endotoxemia, elevated levels of endotoxin in fatty liver disease for sure. You see it in type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative conditions. So it's so, I know I keep coming back to it, but you can't understate how much of an impact it has. And so I think that alone is responsible for the improvement seen in the low carb diet.
So, I mean, that's so interesting because, they're talking about this, the fat oxidation, as being, there's some, if it's already happening. So why is it that more of it would be good? I understand. Like, so let me show you another one. So short term. So let me just pull this one up here. Um, Short-term weight loss and hepatic triglyceride reduction. Evidence of a metabolic advantage with dietary carbohydrate restriction, right? I think it's also important maybe to mention that a lot of these studies are short term, right? So
Mhm.
this is a 2-week dietary carbohydrate and calorie restriction. So the aim of the study was to determine the effectiveness of 2 weeks of this. I think a lot of these studies are really short term. They're 2-week, 4-week, 6-week interventions. No one's looking at, okay, what if you did this for 2 years, right? So I think that's also probably important to take note of.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, and you can see this on the screen right now, short-term weight loss and hepatic.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So, essentially this study is saying that dietary carbohydrate restriction and calorie restriction result in significant weight loss. Okay, no surprise, but also reduction of hepatic triglycerides. However, it's the carbohydrate restriction was notably more effective in reducing liver triglycerides than the calorie restriction. So I'm curious, in your view, would a high carb bioenergetic diet lead to less hepatic triglycerides versus calorie restriction or carbohydrate restriction? So if you remove, right, if you maybe you don't, let's say you don't go super low fat, let's just say you're moderate fat, but
Mhm.
it's just completely 180 degree of what this study is showing with this 2-week intervention. If you flipped it and restricted fat and went high carbohydrate diet, would you see a lowering, in your opinion, of hepatic triglycerides?
So if in this study they did that, probably not, because those carbohydrates are going to be coming from grains and typically like bread and pasta
Yeah.
and things like that. And that's important to note because those are carbohydrates and so is fruit and many
True.
other we've got a lot of other sources, potatoes and things like that. And not all are equal, especially if we're dealing with the microbiome issue, which you
Right.
can assume to be the case if you have fatty liver. You can already assume that you're dealing with excess endotoxin and an imbalanced microbiome. And again, to be clear, I'm not denying that going on a low carb diet will lead to typically short term and pretty dramatic improvement for that period of time. But as you're saying, long term comes at a major cost. A lot of times the issues come back and many other issues come back much worse. Now, in a study like this, I would totally expect that to be the case. And again, more than anything, coming back to the gut. But if we were to compare that to a diet that fed very low fermentable carbohydrates
Uh-huh.
from healthy sources, and we were minimizing our PUFA consumption and providing lots of nutrients, we would also see the improvement in fatty liver disease. And we'll talk about this in your case. I've seen it in many, many other cases, looking at, seeing liver enzymes come down, looking at scans and seeing severe fatty liver reduce or reverse. And none of that is by restricting carbohydrates. Normally it's consuming a lot of carbs, including fructose sources, including fruit, including juices. And it doesn't even necessarily require weight loss either. So a lot of times people will say, oh, that's just a byproduct of weight loss. But I've seen it happen with really very little change in terms of overall body weight, but seeing dramatic improvements in health.
Right. So, and to the point, again, put calorie restriction aside, they're saying even more so than calorie restriction, uh, the the carbohydrate restriction is even better. But your view is that actually, if you use the right carbohydrates, then a high carbohydrate. So again, just to be clear, is it your viewpoint that on a high carb diet, the right carbs, and also the rest of the diet being correct, energy balance correct,
Mhm.
non-PUFA fats, right? Like, just the right type of energy balance approach, but it's high carbohydrate. Is it your view that one would see less reduced hepatic triglycerides?
Yes. Wait, well, just sorry, what are we comparing that to? Or just compared to from
We just
before?
compare. We're not comparing it to anything. We're just
Yeah, yeah,
saying
yeah. Yeah, relative to before. Yes.
yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Exactly. Okay. All right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now,
We could also phrase it as endotoxin reduction, right? Instead of like carbohydrate restriction or talking about anything else, I think endotoxin restriction is a better characterization of what's actually happening here.
so why? Okay. So just to before we move into my blood work and the improvements we're seeing. Why would so? And you may have already said this, so apologies if I'm making you repeat it. But why would a high fat, high protein diet contribute to endotoxin versus? And again, let's say we're talking clean foods in all cases, right? Let's say we're talking about a high fat ketogenic diet with the right types of fats, or we're talking about a super low carb, high protein, carnivore style diet with the right types of protein, versus a bioenergetic energy balance, Jay Feldman approved high carbohydrate diet with the right types of nutrients. Why would the high fat or the carnivore diet contribute to endotoxin versus your approach?
Yeah, so let's call it keto, carnivore, and energy balance just for simplicity.
But
So I
using
would say
but using clean foods.
yes. But I'm just going to refer to it like that so we don't get confused. So I would say that both keto and energy balance would be low endotoxin diets. The carnivore over time can actually lead to the production of toxic things in the microbiome. Could be endotoxin, could also be things like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide and phenols and things like that, because the excess protein fermentation in the colon can lead to a pathogenic microbiome. So that can be an issue long term. But endotoxin is not the only thing that causes fatty liver disease. It's just, I would say, the primary one in most people. So in the ketogenic diet, you're not going to have any endotoxin production. However, you will have over time chronically elevated stress hormones, chronically depressed thyroid, chronically depressed reproductive hormones, and chronically elevated lipolysis, fat oxidation. And those things are directly implicated in fatty liver disease. And over time, those will outweigh the benefit that was originally attained with the endotoxin. So that will potentially still lead to disease processes long term.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you for clearing that up. All right. Let's share my screen again and jump into, let me just get it ready here. I have to sign in. So I'm going to show my blood work. I'm actually signing into my the portal that I use for my health provider. I use Penn Medicine. They're fantastic. I'm just outside of Philadelphia. So let me
I should mention also real quick so I was saying that those effects would happen from keto. They would happen from carnivore as well. So there could be microbiome issues from carnivore long term, but even if there's not, it will still have all those issues that I mentioned with keto long term.
Right.
Oxidative stress,
Right.
lipid metabolism, lipolysis, stress hormones, low thyroid, low hypogonadism, iron overload as well, often.
All horrible issues. Don't wish them on anybody. But ultimately, we're saying that might not cause endotoxin overgrowth.
Right. In
There's
keto
other
and
issues.
carnivore,
There's other
it might
issues.
not. Right. Yeah. But those other issues are still driving the same processes. It's still driving fatty liver disease long term and other issues too.
Okay. Fair enough. Makes sense. All right. Let me share my screen. I've got my blood work up here and I'm able to do it. I could show the trend, which is really cool. Let me share this. All right. Jay, can you see this?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so here we're showing, this is ALT, right? And here's my name up here in the upper right corner, should anyone doubt that this is my my blood work. But here we see ALT. It tells you the normal range should be between 17 and 63. So I want to point out the timeline at the bottom. Can you see the timeline here? At the bottom?
If you scroll down a bit. Oh, yes. Yeah. I see that at the bottom.
At the very bottom here.
X-axis. Yeah.
Okay. So here is so you could see here in January, sorry. So here, December 9th of 2023, right? You could see, and we can go back further than this to actually see when it first erupted. Let's do that actually. So let's look at all data. Here you go. All right, this is you can see here August 12th, 2022. As the start point all the way to now. So we've got almost 2 years worth of data here on my ALT, liver enzyme. This is, so August 27th of 2022, 829. Wow, ring the bell. That's the surgery.
Mhm.
So of course we're going to see that, but you could see over time how that dropped and pretty much resolved, right? My liver healed from the surgery. And then we can go here. July of 2022, just about a year ago, is when I was on that foot cream. I had added a lot of fructose to my diet at the same time. I wish I didn't, because then I would know for sure what was what. But I was doing both of these things in conjunction, and we do my blood work, and lo and behold, look at that. It's 77 here in March. Now we're in July, and it's 100. What the hell happened? And what we can see is that it starts to rise, comes back, starts to come back down, starts to go back up. I'm trying all different things here. I'm like, what am I doing? Right? I don't, I'm trying different foods. I don't know what's going on. And you can see here, November of 2023, it's at 210. So it's getting even higher. So 154. Now it's up here at 229 in December. What the hell's going on? It comes all the way back down from December 9th to January 6th. We have a massive drop. That's good news. I thought I figured it out. What did I do? I started taking Tudco. And I started coming off of, Jay, I started coming off of all the apples and pears because I wasn't sure what was going on. So I greatly lowered the amount of fruit. Maybe I went from 8 apples and pears a day or 6. I don't know how. I was eating a lot. And no honey for sure. But I was seeing an improvement. I think I've got this licked. The Tudc is helping. I'm taking the quercetin. I'm taking the IP6. Okay, I've got this licked. Boom. From January 6th to February 3rd, 235. It's back up. What the hell is going on? And in March of 2023, I'm at 392. So almost 400. And now I decide I'm still eating at this point. I'm eating about 3 to 4 pounds of meat a day. I'm eating a few pieces of fruit, no honey. And I've got, what am I going to do here? So this is where I really dive into your approach. This is where I start increasing the carbohydrates, lowering the meat consumption, adding fruits that I think from your dietary guide, your dietary map, oranges, pineapple. I start adding, right? So these non-fermentable fruits that have, you also talk about, we talk about this, but the glucose to sucrose ratio, I'm sorry, the fructose to glucose ratio being important to consider. So I started eating more of that. And also I started adding some white rice to my diet. So I know on your dietary guide, white rice, easily digestible. If you don't have any issues with it, then it could be a good addition as far as starches go. Maybe not as good as potatoes. I know I started adding some potatoes as well, sweet potato. So sweet potato, white rice, oranges, pineapple, and the meat consumption came down to about maybe about 2 pounds from 3 to 4 pounds. And we see this drop from 392 to 302 from March to April, just 2 weeks later. We see a nice drop. So I'm like, I'm not getting too excited because I've seen this before. But now I decide I'm going all in, and I add a lot more. So I add a bit more oranges. I add a bit more white rice, a bit more potato, lower the meat again. Now I'm down to about 0.75 pound of meat a day when I was up at 3 or 4 pounds, mostly now carbohydrate based. We come down from April 6th to April 20th, again, just a couple of weeks later, we're at 111 on the ALT. And then I'm like, I'm all in here. I start adding some juice. Never drinking juice. Juice is the worst thing, Jay. You can't have fruit juice. Everyone tells you it's as bad as soda. But I added orange juice and some pineapple juice. And again, just, complete reversal. Super high, probably eating about 600 grams of carbohydrates a day, maybe about 120 grams worth of protein. The fat is down at about maybe 10% of the diet. right? According to the app I'm using, I'm probably getting about, I don't know, maybe 60 to 80, maybe 60-ish grams of fat a day. Not a lot, right? And May 4th. So from April 20th to May 4th, a couple of weeks later, 58 on the ALT. Then 43 on the ALT. It's normal for the first time. And then June 8th was the last. So a couple of weeks ago, Jay, was the last blood test I did. And we're still in the normal range here. Look at this. I haven't seen this in how long? I'm talking about, haven't seen this in years. I haven't seen normal. Here's right before my surgery, Jay, 2 years ago. My liver enzymes were 68, right? So just above the normal range. And then I go into the surgery. So it's still in this right yellow zone. It's not in the green zone. It isn't until I went onto your approach that for the first time in the last couple of years that I've had normal ALT. What's going on, Jay? Explain this to me. Because and by the way, I do a scan, and the scan that correlates with this time frame, because I'm monitored. They weren't scanning me for fatty liver. I get scanned for the cancer, right? Every 4 to 6 months, I get a follow-up. So the one that I had done in November showed mild steatosis, but the one that I did again in around March time, around March showed nothing, no liver. And then they made me do a ferrous scan, which measures the amount of iron in your liver, and that showed no steatosis whatsoever. So the steatosis is gone. The ALT normal. Let's and then just also let's check AST.
Sure. And just to clarify for listeners, steatosis is fatty liver. That just means fat in
Yes,
the liver.
exactly. So here you go. Super high when I did the surgery, 457 on the AST. It shouldn't be, but 15 to 41 is normal. Surgery knocks it up to 457. I recover, right? It's normal here in March of 2023. Then it starts its climb, just like the ALT starts going up, gets to a point in March 182. But then with your approach, we start to get into the normal range. Now, my last blood test on June 8th, it came back up again, 44, but 41 is the top end of the normal range. 3 points higher than that, I'm not going to complain compared to what I was seeing. What's going on, Jay? Let's put the NAFLD aside. I'll tell you why. Sure. Because in my case, the NAFLD, the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the steatosis, that came after the ALT and the AST started showing signs of liver function alteration. Because back then, even with the elevated liver enzymes, we saw no steatosis. It came later on as the liver enzymes were climbing and the liver stress was climbing. All of a sudden, we saw the steatosis. The steatosis was not the cause of the elevated liver enzymes or the altered liver function. So let's take NAFLD out of it. It's sure. Nice to see it's no longer there. But why would the stress on the liver start to resolve as I'm taking your approach?
Yeah. So I think there are a few primary changes we can talk about. One is we dramatically lowered the protein and fat. The protein is still in a good range. We're still getting enough, but lowered it quite a bit from the 3 or 4 pounds of meat you were having a day.
Right.
I think closer to 4. We dramatically increased the carbs. And then, and we made sure it was easy to digest carbs as well, right? Not having the apples and pears, which we know can be quite a bit harder to digest. There are fermentable carbs in there, and there's a much higher amount of glucose or of fructose to glucose, which is only an issue because we can't absorb it as well. So that can make it harder to digest as well.
Okay.
So we shift toward easily digestible carbs. We increase them quite a bit, and we lower the protein and fat. And not excessively with the protein, of course, we need enough.
Yes.
And so the result, I think the biggest, clearest one, there's a couple. One is we're going to have dramatically improved mitochondrial function where we're producing ATP much more effectively, much more efficiently, with much less oxidative stress, much less reactive oxygen species. And it's shown that in fatty liver and liver inflammation, the excess lipid oxidation is a primary driver there because of the increased oxidative stress as a result of relying on lipid oxidation. So that's one factor. And then the other is, as a result of that, we've dramatically lowered our systemic stress. So I'm sure if we were measuring things, the stress hormones, which sometimes are tough to measure because they fluctuate so much, but knowing what's going on systemically, we had way lower stress hormones here, meaning lower lipolysis, which is great because that lipolysis contributes to some of these issues.
Mhm.
But the stress hormones alone put a huge burden on the liver and create that inflammatory process in the liver. They force it to produce a lot of glucose via gluconeogenesis,
Right.
as a cost of ammonia production as well. And some people are of the belief that, it's a internal process that's normal. So how could it be bad? But cortisol is a normal hormone that we produce as needed as well. But that doesn't mean we want to do things to encourage it. High levels of cortisol we know are a problem. And relying excessively on gluconeogenesis is a result of stress and compounds and adds to that stress. It's something that is extremely inefficient compared to just using glucose itself. And so we generally don't want to rely on that process. And so that would have been dramatically downregulated. We would have improved our glycogen storage at the liver. And by reducing the impacts of the stress hormones at the liver,
Mhm.
which amplify the stress and inflammation, we're seeing major relief there as well. So those would be the main things I'd be pointing at. We maintained low endotoxin. We dramatically lowered our systemic stress state. We dramatically increased our energy availability, our conversion of fuel to energy, and the amount of high quality fuel we had available. And those things are massively important for reducing inflammation, oxidative stress, and reducing the liver fat. That even though that happened later on as a result of the inflammation, we saw
Right.
both of those things go away. And that's, I know that wasn't the central thing, but most people would be very surprised at, adding juice and tons of fruit, tons of carbohydrates, lots of starches as well, and to see reversal of the liver enzymes and the fatty liver again without any change, I'm assuming, in terms of, massive body weight loss or
I
something.
mean, I
This
even
wasn't compounded by losing weight.
no, I didn't. No, actually, if anything, I've gained probably about, I've had to cut down on the rice. I was getting nuts. But I'm probably now. I was 153. I'm only 5'6", so I was about 153 pounds when I really went all in on this approach. Now maybe 161.
Uh-huh.
So a bit of a weight gain, but you can still see my abs. So I'm still in great shape, still working out. That hasn't changed. Um, I think what's interesting that people should be aware of as well is that usually it's the fatty liver causing these issues. It's people should understand that liver inflammation you could end up with fatty liver as a result, as
Yeah.
opposed to the reverse, right?
Yeah.
So that, yeah. Okay, another marker I want to show you. Let me kill the ALT and AST. I want to show you something which changed, which I've never seen normal in all the time. Again, almost, I mean, 7 years before I changed, start eating some fruit. Always my urea nitrogen,
Mm.
when from the beginning of going on the ketogenic diet, I'm going to just all data here. It has almost never been normal, right? So my urea nitrogen, right, should be between 8 and 20. So here, when I had the surgery, it was normal. You know why? Because I wasn't eating. I had no food coming in. And in this state here, it seemed to resolve. But back on the diet, full bore here, right? October 29, 2022. It's 41. So urea nitrogen, normal is 8 to 20. Here I'm 41, and it is always high. It is always, right? Always over 2 years. Look at this. And if I could show you my blood work from 8 years, although I haven't been going to this, to Penn Medicine for all that time, I lived elsewhere. But this is 2 years worth of data. Never has it been normal. And then only when you look at the drop here again, March 23rd, that's the same time we started to see, that this was the height, and then the drop off when I take the energy balance Jay Feldman approach, things start to resolve, get much, and boom, for the first time in almost 8 years, it's normal. Why would that be?
Yeah, so when we're looking at urea and nitrogen, most people know this as BUN, a
Yes,
BUN test. We're looking at a marker of kidney function. And the reason why it's a marker of kidney function is because if you're seeing elevated levels of urea and nitrogen, it's basically a waste product from the kidneys that the kidneys aren't doing as good of a job of clearing. Now, one of the things that is known to stress the kidneys is excess ammonia, excess protein, which normally it requires quite a bit of protein to do that, but we were talking about really quite a lot of protein, quite a lot of gluconeogenesis, quite a lot of systemic stress,
right.
all of which are putting a big burden on a single kidney, right? We only have one instead of two,
That's
and
right.
so probably some reduced function there, and then also probably some extra endotoxin too from the apples and pears at that time. And endotoxin and kidney dysfunction are very tightly correlated as well. And as we're talking about the systemic stress state, you add cortisol and take out energy to a system, to an organism, and a lot of things start to go downhill. And liver function, kidney function are very common ones. And that's, I think, the biggest highlight here that we've seen is when we're talking energy balance, we've talked about dramatically improving our energy production and availability, dramatically lowering stress hormones, and as a result, dramatically lowering inflammation and improving liver function and kidney function.
Yeah, just amazing. I, you know, I honestly, I feel amazing. I feel great. And yeah, just these, I didn't have to go for the biopsy. We started, I had it, it got so bad at that point, in March where we saw the highest of these highs. I had to schedule it. So I was literally going in, and a few days before I got the blood results that it came down from almost 400, the ALT from almost 400 to just about 300. I was like, hold on a second, hold on, hold. And then, yeah, it kept going down. So we didn't have to do the biopsy. My doctors who are looking at this, they're just like, okay, great. We don't have to do it. It's like, and by the way, I also stopped taking all of my supplements.
Mm.
So I told you before, quercetin, not taking quercetin. I'm really only taking one round of IP6 a day, but that's for the cancer because IP6 has been shown in a lot of studies to be great for a lot of different cancers, to kind of keep things at bay. But stop taking the quercetin. I stopped taking magnesium. I stopped taking TUDCA. I stopped taking boron. So I was taking a lot of supplements. Um, just with the diet, we're seeing this kind of improvement, and it's not. I mean, it's dramatic, right? Like this is dramatic improvement.
Yeah,
Um,
just in weeks time.
yeah, weeks. That's right. You're right. Weeks. It's like, which is just insane. And listen, I have to. Yeah. All right. I'll say something in a moment. So one last question I have before we kind of wrap up is that, I've heard you talk about, you've said it here as well, the danger of fermentable fruits, right? These ferment, right? Like apples and pears being and that's and I think that's, anything that's on the FODMAP, right? I think that's
Mhm.
something you might have to be careful of. But what I'm curious about um, is your thoughts on fermented foods
Mm.
for health, fermented vegetables, sauerkraut, kimchi. What are your thoughts on fermentable foods as opposed to foods that can ferment in the gut? I'm curious.
Yeah, good distinction. And one other distinction I want to make is that the fermentable carbohydrates, normally called FODMAPs, which is not it's not all encompassing, but maybe a good starting place for recognizing those. Those are not inherently bad. We
Okay.
just want to be careful with them, especially if we have gut issues or if we bring in high FODMAP foods and that causes symptoms, that could be responsible. Long term, we should be able to bring those back in because as our microbiome improves and our health improves, it's not a bad thing to be feeding healthy bacteria with fermentable carbohydrates from fruits or cooked vegetables. That's not an issue. It actually helps to maintain a healthy microbiome. So it is not a universal these are bad, but in a moment they might not be ideal, for a period of time. So
Right.
just an important distinction there. And it's a good transition to talking about fermentable foods. So or fermented foods, right? Talking about, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, uh, a number of other possible fermented foods and maybe probiotics as a whole. So there are possible positives or benefits and negatives with these. And I would treat them with caution with that in mind, because when we have a compromised intestine, let's say, gut microbiome, gut health, maybe we have slow motility, maybe we don't break down our food as well, maybe our large intestine's already a little imbalanced. When we add bacteria into that environment, sometimes it can be a little dangerous or it can have negative outcomes.
Okay.
So, as an example, they've found that in people with compromised gut health and immune function, if you add in probiotics, supposedly healthy ones, it can actually create a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth with the strains that we're introducing. We're actually bringing those bacteria in, they overgrow in a place we don't want, which is the small intestine. And then you have SIBO and all of the issues that come with that. And then those bacteria are consuming the food that we're eating, producing endotoxin and causing a lot of damage, maybe triggering autoimmune conditions or fatty liver or brain fog or joint pain or whatever other things we might be dealing with. So I wouldn't treat probiotics or ingested bacteria from fermentable foods as universally beneficial. I think we need to treat them with caution, but they can be beneficial. They can help with our microbiome and with our gut health. They can have anti-inflammatory effects, but that doesn't mean they will. And so we want to treat them with caution. We want to test them independently. I would say I would be very weary of ones that have added probiotics in there, especially if we don't know the exact strain of each bacteria that's added, because then you're just guessing, right? And this is not something we really want to guess with. So that's the first thing. And even if we're buying fermented foods that don't have added probiotics, we're still kind of guessing. It's up to the exact bacteria that happened to be in that batch, from what was in the air, what was on the food, what happened in that period of time.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It could be beneficial for you. And if someone tries it and they feel benefits, great, go for it. But there is a bit of kind of rolling the dice involved. And I don't love to do that in general. And we don't have to do that. We don't have to eat fermented foods for a healthy microbiome. And this is, I think, one of the negatives that has come about from the kind of paleo functional medicine space with the focus on gut health, especially in relation to autoimmunity, which is this idea that we need to be eating lots of probiotic containing foods. But the reality is those bacteria don't necessarily increase those same bacteria species in the large intestine. So that's not actually it's not actually necessarily accomplishing the goal that we're aiming for. So that's part one. And part two is they can cause negative effects, especially when we have a compromised microbiome. So instead, we want to recognize that the bacterial strains are generally already there. We just want to encourage the growth of the right ones and minimize the growth of the harmful ones. And as our digestion improves, and maybe we're introducing low fermentable foods with polyphenols, like all of the fruits that we've talked about and cooked root vegetables, those polyphenols have gentle antibiotic and antimicrobial effects that are selective against the harmful bacteria. So, for example, we were talking about Akkermansia earlier, and fasting is something that has been shown to increase it. Ketogenic diets can increase it, but so can lots of carbohydrate containing foods like pomegranate. The polyphenols in there, and I believe grape as well, and a number of others, are really effective for encouraging the growth of Akkermansia as well. And you can eat grapes, let's say, and they don't have much in the way of fermentable carbohydrates, but they do have those polyphenols. So you're getting the usable carbs that your body needs to keep stress down and energy up, and you're going to help to modulate the microbiome in a healthy way. So that's the type of approach I would rather take, which is we're providing the right fibers from fruits and vegetables when we tolerate them, when we're able to, and we're providing the polyphenols to keep the harmful ones at bay, and we're providing the nutrition. Because if we're in a chronic stress state, that's not going to be ideal for our microbiome. It impairs immune function. Cortisol is great for suppressing our immune system. That's really well known. And that's going to affect the overgrowth of harmful bacteria. And then, did you want to jump in, Lawrence?
No, go ahead. I'm just go ahead.
Okay. And then, along with that, when we're under stress, that means reduced blood flow to our digestive system, worse digestive processes, feeding of the bad bacteria with substrate that shouldn't be ever heading to the microbiome. So, and then there's also direct benefit of carbohydrates in the intestines, lowering inflammation by feeding the intestinal cells there that really like the carbohydrates. So there's a lot of ways that shifting toward this sort of approach will help to balance and fix the microbiome. And we don't need to be avoiding carbs. We don't need to be adding in or guessing with adding in probiotics or adding in fermentable foods.
Interesting. Very interesting. I wanted to ask that because we talk about fermentable, good fermentable, and that's right now fermentable foods are another big you know, the influencers are all over it right now. So I did want to bring that up. Okay, one last point, because you talked about cortisol and immunity. One chart I got to show you. Let me share my screen one last time. This is my white blood cell count. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is going back to October of 2023, experiencing all these issues. Normal white blood cell range, 4.0 on the low, 11.0 on the high. Obviously, you want to not see super high white blood cell counts either, right? Because that's indicative of an infection.
Mm-hmm.
So we see here that my white blood cell count is very low. It's not, it's below the lowest, but it's below the floor of 4.0, 3.3, 3.1, 3.3, right? For a very long time. And then, you know, as we start to get to this inflection point where I'm seeing my highest liver enzymes, it's actually it's getting to its lowest, right? Here, April 6th, 2.7. This is when I'm just starting to make that big change, the big switch. And then we see it start to come up a little bit, 2.9. By May, for the first time in a very long time, my white blood cell count is in the normal range. And so this as well has changed. And so you talk about cortisol and immunity. I'm wondering if that was at issue here as well.
Certainly looks like it. Yeah. Yeah. Elevated stress and lack of energy suppressing immune function for sure.
Yeah, and so you see that my by the way, we also saw that my my neutrophils were low as well for the same period that the white blood cell count was the neutrophils that were actually low. So there you go. So Jay, you know, I'm going to tell you right now, you know, I want to thank you for the content you put out there, because you know, the fact that I found you, and by the way, I'm going to say this, God led me to you. Christ led me to you, because there is no way, anyone who knows me knows there would be no way I would ever be advocating for a high carbohydrate diet. Me going on a high carbohydrate diet is almost akin to Sean Baker, the carnivore king, going on weight-based diet. Right? That's how unlikely this actually is. The fact that not only did I find you, but that I actually listened to what you were saying and actually applied it, given I've already been down the repeat road before when I was in dire straits and I rejected it. So there was something about finding you, listening to your content, listening to the way you approached it, that it had to be a God thing. It's a God thing. I'm telling you right now, Christ led me to you. And thanks to your content, thanks to your approach, thanks to your ideas, and it's also the way you communicate them, and the very well thought out approach that you take. You're not bombastic, right? You're not a sensationalist. Your content is really, really well put together, really well thought out, to the degree that you could convince a carnivore, 7-year keto carnivore, to do this. And, you know, it's not like, oh, I'm desperate, I'll try anything, right? The last thing I would have ever done was add sugar, of all things, to my diet. So thank you, God, thank you, Christ, and thank you, Jay Feldman. Thank you for the content you put out. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It certainly made a difference in my life. I mean, like, life-altering difference. So yeah, I wanted to give you, you know, some praise here, and also thank you.
Well, yeah, you're very welcome, and I appreciate the praise. That's always, you know, every time it's always so amazing to see these sorts of improvements, and I'm glad that you were still open enough to, you know, at that point, despite being deep in carnivore. No,
I definitely wasn't open. Trust me, I wasn't open. But, you know, like I said, you know, a higher power led me to you, and somehow you cracked the armor. And, again, it's not like I haven't heard this before, but the way you approach it, it makes sense to the point where, you really have to rethink your entire framework. And that's not an easy thing for anyone to do. And I'm sure you see a lot of people who have been on long-term carnivore and ketogenic diets coming to you with all sorts of issues that they don't understand. They don't understand what's happening. Is that the case?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. And normally it's not liver enzymes quite like this. Normally it's insomnia and so,
Okay.
seeing lower testosterone and libido and maybe some skin issues cropping up, some digestive issues. It's sometimes it is the autoimmunity and intense things and weight regain that even though they were super strict carnivore and keto, they started regaining lots of weight. So a lot of times it is a number of things, but normally not quite the liver enzymes we were seeing.
Well, yeah, just fantastic stuff. Keep doing what you're doing, Jay. It's amazing. And I implore anyone that's out there that hasn't checked out your podcast, the Energy Balance podcast, get onto it because it is. I mean, you have well over 100 episodes now, and there's just so much incredible information in there. If you could share with all of our viewers where they can reach you, where they can find your content. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, that would be.
Definitely, yeah. And thanks again for having me. Thanks for the praise, and I'm again really really happy to hear about all the improvements. Yeah, so you mentioned earlier the Energy Balance Food Guide. I think that's the best place for listeners to start.
Yeah.
They can download that for free at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. It has two different spectrums for all different foods based on how well they support your metabolism and also which ones we might want to be a bit more careful with in the case that we're dealing with some digestive issues. We mentioned apples and pears earlier, and so that's accounted for there and always something to consider when we talked about how big of an impact endotoxin can have. So
Hmm.
I think that's a great starting place. My website is jayfeldmanwellness.com, and the podcast, as you said, is called the Energy Balance Podcast.
Powerful stuff. Jay Feldman Wellness. This is the Alpha Human Podcast. We're out.